I'm a uni student now, but this incident happened when I was in the 8th grade. When I was around 14, I studied a subject focusing on outdoor pursuits. For a final assessment, 2 teachers took my class on a one-night camping trip where we do activities like rock climbing, kayaking, trail walking, etc. I live in Australia, around an hour from a state forest that was notorious for the backpacker murderers. Several bodies have been found and several more remain missing. I'm pretty sure all of the murders were linked to the same serial killer. Anyway, in the morning we left the school. We drove out in a bus. When we reached the road that leads to the entrance of the forest, a police car was parked to the side. He spoke to the teacher for a moment, but I didn't hear anything, and no one else seemed to notice or care either. Fast forward a few hours, and we trekked to the camping area, somewhere in the middle of the state forest. While kayaking that afternoon, we noticed a helicopter doing flybys, but again, my classmates never suspected anything. A couple of our mates and I were the first to leave the water and helped the teacher with some equipment and started building our own rafts. I was standing off to the side when one of the national park guides walked over to one of the instructors and talked in a hushed, slightly stressed out tone. I remember hearing the instructor say stuff like, "You're kidding," and "I don't believe it." He just looked shocked and taken aback. So at this point, I started connecting the dots, but I didn't say anything to my school friends. Around dusk that night, I went to use the toilet block, which is around 100 meters from the main campsite. As I go in, I remember a guy walking around to the other side of the block. I didn't see him very clearly in the diminished light, but he kept glancing around with very nervous body language. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't part of our party, and to me, he just didn't fit in. I didn't think much of it at the time, though. Fast forward to the next morning when we got back to the car park. The teacher tells us that a body was found in a dam not far from where we were. They didn't want to tell us earlier, just not to frighten us. We later found out it was a young guy who was killed with an axe, and the guy who did it was related to the serial killer who hunted in the same area. I don't know if the guy that I saw had anything at all to do with the murders, but it freaked me out a lot afterwards. I haven't been camping since. So, this happened to my parents back in the late 80s. They were in their mid-20s when this all occurred. My parents decided to go camping in cool California. When they got there, it was kind of late. My mom was sitting down on a log while my dad was unpacking the truck. While sitting down, she heard someone walking around the campsite, so she went and quietly told my dad she heard someone was walking around. They got the fuck out of there, just in case. They drove about 3 miles down the road with their headlights off so they wouldn't be followed. Now, they don't know for sure that this next event was connected to the first, but they believe it is. So they settled in and my dad was asleep far before my mom. My mom was in the halfway state before you're halfway awake and halfway asleep. Suddenly, she heard footsteps outside the tent. She abruptly snapped back to the consciousness and listened. She tried waking my dad, but he was way too out of it. She listened for what seemed like hours when she suddenly hears in the creepiest voice you could probably ever imagine saying, "Here I am. I'm going to kill you." While saying this, the man ran what she believes to be a knife along the tent. She could hear him walking and dragging the knife. She was literally frozen. She couldn't say anything or move. With her mouth hanging wide open, she finally snapped out of it and screamed, "Jim, grab the shotgun. Kill that son of a bitch." With that, my dad finally awoke. They heard snapping of twigs and footsteps and heard the guy running away. Of course, my parents didn't have a shotgun. It was a huge bluff that actually worked. My dad got up seconds later and began to run after him, but he was long gone. After that, my parents decided they were going to get the fuck out of there before anything else happened. When they got to their car, their tires were slashed. They were in the middle of nowhere and no way out with some maniac that wanted to kill them. They actually tried blowing up their tires with one of those things you use to blow up rafts. Obviously, that didn't work, but they had to try, right? About an hour later or so, a ranger that was patrolling the area came along and helped them out. He brought them back to town so they could get their tires fixed. While talking to the ranger, they found out that he had been searching for any suspicious activity due to recent murders nearby. My parents were likely the murderer's next victims. I tried finding some of the murder cases online, but I was unable to. I love camping. Anytime my friends and I come home from college, we would load up our cooler with beer, grab some gear, and go screw around outside. One day, the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, hopped in a car I borrowed from a buddy, and drove to a spot that was secluded yet within a safe distance to civilization that I could run and get help if needed. Camping also creeps me out sometimes, but that creepy feeling is also somewhat of a plus for me. It's the same reason that people read these stories. It's fun to be scared. So I make a little camp and get a fire going. I hear a twig crunch from over to my right, then I see a doe bolt from about 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to the camp with the armful of wood I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out, hearing sounds just outside the ring of the light cast by the fire. I hadn't brought all that much to eat, but I was enjoying myself, reading and looking around the area and that sort of thing. I got the feeling I was being watched, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I always let it get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whittling a stick I had been messing with. Around 1 o'clock, I decided to get into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I had been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigars, so I passed out relatively quick. About 2 o'clock, I started hearing footsteps. They sounded pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself that it's a deer or another animal, more likely a raccoon, because I had probably left some food out. I'm still on guard, though. After about 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, I hear a rubbing noise, and the tent fabric is being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't shit my sleeping bag, but I just sat there paralyzed with my K-bar in my hand. I desperately wanted to thrust a knife through the tent fabric, but I was still holding out hope that it was some of my buddies from a frat joking with me. Then as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. I was starting to feel slightly more secure because daylight would be coming in about 2 to 3 hours, but I sure as shit wasn't going to sleep now. All of a sudden, at about 4 o'clock, I realized I should put my boots on so that if anything did happen, I would be ready. After having stayed up and keeping alert a little while longer, my friend's car alarm goes blaring. I freaked the fuck out and run out of the tent. I got about 2 steps before something grabs me around the mouth. I open my mouth to scream, but instead the person's pinky finger slips between my teeth. I've heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge adrenaline rushes. In my case, I just clamped down and his finger popped off. He screamed, pulling his hand away with the missing digit falling to the ground. He took off running down the hill I was camping on, and I took off right quick in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to, a little sorority girl in a white beater, boxers, and a steel-toe boots. I also had some blood that oozed out of my lip, not from the finger, but because I had also managed to take a pretty good chunk out of my lip as well. I told them what happened. They called the police, got me some real clothing, and the man at the house made a whiskey and coke. When the cops got there, they checked it out. The cop went to check it out, and when they came back, it was light out. They brought me back so I could get my friend's car, and what I saw just made me more scared. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have just lit me on fire earlier. The finger was also gone, suggesting that he had come back. The kicker is they never really caught the guy, so somewhere out there is a man sitting down to dinner, maybe alone, maybe with a wife and a couple of kids, and he's missing his right pinky.